Tonight, we're going to take a slow, quiet look at what it was really like to be sick in the 1700s, a time when even a small illness could feel like the end of the world. There were no real medicines, no pain relief, and most people didn't even understand what made them sick in the first place. Being unwell back then meant long days in bed, strange home remedies, and very little comfort. So, before you get comfortable, subscribe to the channel and like the video and comment down where are you watching from and at what time. So just relax, settle in, and let yourself drift off as we walk through the quiet, difficult world of sickness in a time long before modern medicine. It starts slow. Not dramatic, not all at once. Just wrong. A strange weight in your bones. Like you've been hauling sacks of flour through rain, even though you've only been sleeping. Your eyelids feel sticky, your mouth dry. You blink up at the ceiling, or rather, the wooden beams overhead. They look the same as always, familiar, cracked, slightly curved like the back of an old man. But today there's something different in the way your eyes try to focus on them. Everything swims. Everything tilts just slightly off-center. And then the aching starts. Not sharp, not sudden. Just a dull, constant throb. In your joints. In your temples. Behind your eyes. You try to sit up, but even that simple motion makes the world pitch and sway like a boat caught in a slow tide. Something's not right. You know it. You've known it since before your eyes even opened, really. It was there in your dreams, those strange, fevered dreams that didn't quite feel like dreams at all. Just endless walking, wandering through a forest with no path, calling out to no one in particular. You'd sweat, then shiver, then sweat again. But now you're awake, and whatever was bothering you in the dream has followed you into the waking world. You groan. But no one comes. Because it's the 1700s. You don't get to call for help. There's no emergency room. No urgent care. No phone on the bedside table. The nearest thing to a thermometer is a hand pressed against your forehead, and that hand might be your own, or maybe a tired family member who already has too many things to do. It's still dark outside. The fire in the hearth is down to soft red coals. The cold has crept in, crawling into your bed like an unwelcome visitor. Your blanket feels damp. You don't remember sweating this much, but you must have, because everything around you feels clammy and uncomfortable. The sheet is stuck to your back. You look around, slowly. There's a jug of water on the small wooden stool next to your bed. You reach for it, your arm shaking more than it should. Lifting it feels like trying to lift a brick, but you manage. The water is stale. It's been sitting there for days. No one changes the water daily. That's a luxury. You drink anyway because your throat feels like sandpaper, and even this stagnant, room temperature water is better than nothing. The taste is metallic. A little sour. You set the jug down with trembling fingers and let your head fall back onto the rough linen pillow. You feel it again, the ache, the weight, the fog in your head. Something isn't right. You know this feeling. You've felt it before, and you've seen others go through it. Sometimes they got better. Sometimes they didn't. You try to remember the last time you felt this way. Maybe last winter, when that cough took hold and wouldn't let go. Or the year before, when everyone in the village seemed to be sneezing and shivering for weeks. You remember the smell of boiled onions and vinegar, the sounds of retching behind thin walls, the quiet whisper of prayers muttered into pillows. You remember how long it took to get better, and how not everyone did. You close your eyes and breathe slowly. Even that simple act feels strange. Your nose is blocked. Your chest is tight. It's not painful, not yet, but it's enough to make you aware of every breath. You start to count them without realizing it, just trying to keep yourself calm. You don't know what this is. Fever. A chill. The grip. That vague word that people use for everything. You don't know. No one really does. That's the worst part, in some ways. The not knowing. In the 1700s, there's no real diagnosis. You don't get blood tests or scans. You get feelings and guesses. You wake up feeling sick, and all you have is your own body to tell you what might be wrong. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it screams. Right now, it's murmuring, low and steady, like a warning drum off in the distance. You hear the floor creak outside your door. Someone is up. Maybe they heard you stirring. Maybe they were already awake. You hope they come in. You don't want to call out. Your voice feels fragile. But you want someone to know. Someone to see you lying here like this, blinking at the ceiling, too hot and too cold at the same time, wondering how bad it will get. The door opens just a crack. It's your sister, or maybe your mother, or whoever it is that takes care of the household when things go wrong. They step inside, barefoot on the wooden floor, holding a candle that flickers with each small gust of air. "Are you all right?" they whisper. You shake your head. They nod once. That's all. No panic. No alarm. Just a quiet acceptance. People wake up sick all the time. It's a part of life. It's not strange. It's not unusual. It's just something that happens. And sometimes it gets better. And sometimes it doesn't. They step closer, set the candle on the stool, and place a cool hand on your forehead. They frown slightly but don't say anything. You wonder what they're thinking. You wonder if they've seen this before. You wonder if they're already planning who to ask for help. You close your eyes again and sigh. You're sick. You don't know what it is. You don't know how long it will last. You don't know if it will pass quietly or grow into something darker. All you know is that it started this morning. Or maybe in the night. Or maybe days ago, slowly building under the surface like rot in the wall. And now you're here. Flat on your back, the fire nearly out, the water jug nearly empty, and your body full of mystery. In the 1700s, this is the start of sickness. There's no real beginning, no clear middle, and often, no ending you can control. Just a long, slow journey into uncertainty. And you've only just taken the first step. So now you're lying in bed. The room is spinning, your bones are aching, and your breath doesn't quite feel right. You're sweating in waves, first a chill, then a fever, then a cold sweat that leaves your clothes damp and your blanket twisted in a knot. Your family knows you're sick. You know you're sick. But what now? Someone quietly asks, should we send for the doctor? That one question, it hangs in the air for longer than it should. You'd think the answer would be obvious. Of course you should call a doctor, right? That's what we're used to thinking in modern times. The moment someone gets sick, especially if it seems serious, you call for help. You schedule an appointment. You hop in the car, or someone calls an ambulance, or you go online to book a telehealth visit. It's automatic. But in the 1700s, it's not automatic at all. It's a decision. A serious one. And not just because of how sick you are, but because of what it costs. First, there's the problem of finding a doctor. Depending on where you live, there might not even be one nearby. If you're in a city, a large one, like London or Boston or Paris, you might have a handful of options, though even then, most people wouldn't know where to start. Doctors didn't advertise like they do now. You might know of one by reputation, or through a friend who used him last year when their cousin caught something dreadful. Maybe he has a little brass plaque near his door. Or maybe not. But if you're in the countryside, good luck. Doctors were spread thin in the 1700s. Really thin. Most small villages didn't have one living nearby. Maybe there was a barber surgeon a few miles away who pulled teeth and treated wounds with a rough touch and a steady pour of alcohol. Maybe there was a traveling apothecary who came through twice a month selling powders and ointments. But a real physician? One with formal training, usually from a university like Edinburgh or Padua or Leiden, they were rare. They were educated, respected, and mostly served the upper class. Their time was precious, and their visits were limited. Even if there was a doctor within reach, you still had to get to him. Or he had to get to you. And that could mean sending a family member on horseback, or by foot, in rain or mud or snow, just to deliver a message. And then waiting. Hoping the doctor had time. Hoping he'd come. And that brings us to the second problem. Money. Doctors in the 1700s didn't come cheap. Their services were considered a luxury. Seeing a doctor was like hiring a lawyer or a private tutor. If you were poor, or even just not rich, it might not even be considered. Most people didn't have the money to spare. Paying for a doctor could mean giving up food for the week. It could mean borrowing against next month's wages. It could mean going into debt. A physician might charge just for the visit, just to walk into your room and look you over. And then he'd charge again for the medicine, which he might mix himself, or he might send you to the local apothecary with a slip of instructions. Either way, nothing was free. And unlike today, there was no insurance, no public health service, no safety net. If you couldn't pay, the doctor didn't come. Simple as that. Some doctors, to be fair, did offer help to the poor. Charity cases. They might visit a sick child or an old woman out of kindness or a sense of duty. But those visits were rare, and they depended entirely on the doctor's generosity, or his boredom. Most of the time, if you couldn't pay, you were on your own. And that's the irony. In a time when being sick was often a life or death situation, the help you needed most was locked behind doors you couldn't afford to open. Even for those who could afford it, there were risks. A doctor's help was no guarantee of survival. Far from it. Medical knowledge in the 1700s was limited. Theories about the human body were often centuries old. The idea of balancing the four humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, still ruled many physicians' thinking. Diagnosis was guesswork. Treatment was more like experimentation. But still, people hoped. So someone in your house makes the decision. Maybe your mother looks at you, pale and shivering under a damp blanket, and decides it's time. She sends your older brother out with a coin pouch and a name. He rides off, hoping to find the doctor at home. If not, maybe he'll wait in the cold until he returns from another visit. Hours pass. Maybe the day turns into night. Maybe it's the next morning. And finally, the doctor arrives. He steps into your room, tall and stern, with a worn black coat and a leather satchel. Maybe he smells faintly of tobacco and herbs. He pulls up a stool next to your bed. He doesn't smile. He doesn't offer comfort. That's not his job. His job is to examine, to observe, to decide. He touches your wrist to check your pulse. He looks at your eyes. He asks questions. How long? Where does it hurt? Do you have blood in your stool? Maybe he opens your mouth and peers at your tongue. He frowns and rubs his chin. He thinks. He doesn't tell you what's wrong. Not really. He might say you have an inflammation of the humors or an imbalance of bile. Maybe he calls it a putrid fever or ague. Vague names. Old names. Words that don't tell you anything except that you're very sick. Then he opens his bag. Inside are vials and bottles. Dried herbs. A pewter syringe. A small, curved knife. A pewter bowl, maybe. He mixes something and gives it to you in a spoon. It tastes awful, like old metal and burnt flowers. Maybe he bleeds you. Maybe he applies a mustard plaster to your chest or tells your mother to boil nettle tea. And then, he leaves. He's done. On to the next house. The next cough. The next cry for help. Your family pays him. A few silver coins, maybe. Or they promise to send chickens or flour later, if they're short. Maybe they haggle. Maybe there's tension in the air, because everyone knows it's too expensive, and yet no one can argue. And now, once again, you're alone in bed. Still sick. Still unsure. Maybe whatever the doctor gave you helps. Maybe it does nothing. Maybe it makes things worse. But he's gone now. And whether you live or die, is mostly up to your body. That's what calling a doctor was like in the 1700s. It was a roll of the dice. And most people couldn't even afford to roll. Sometimes the doctor didn't come. Maybe you couldn't afford him. Maybe he was too far away. Maybe someone else in town was already dying and he was at their bedside instead. Whatever the reason, you were still lying there, sick and confused, without any clear idea of what was happening inside your body. So what now? This is where people turned to what they knew, or thought they knew. The strange collection of wisdom passed down from parents and grandparents. Whispers from neighbors. Notes scribbled in the margins of an old Bible or inside a kitchen drawer. Home remedies, superstition, and folk knowledge. These were the tools most people actually used. Because they were cheap. They were nearby. And they were, for lack of anything better, familiar. Your mother might go into the kitchen and start mixing something together. Not because she knew it would work, but because her mother did the same thing when she was little. Maybe she boils onions in milk. Maybe she crushes garlic into a paste and spreads it on your chest with a cloth. Maybe she adds vinegar, or honey, or a bit of whiskey. Sometimes, someone would steep a few dried herbs in hot water and spoon the mixture into your mouth, whether or not you wanted it. Bitter teas made from horehound or burdock root, things that had grown wild in the garden or been dried and bundled months ago, just in case. You'd drink them, or try to. Some made you gag. Some burned. Some did nothing at all. But people believed in them because they had nothing else. And sometimes, if you happened to get better afterward, that was enough proof that the remedy had worked. It didn't matter if the healing came from rest or chance or the slow strength of your immune system. People wanted something they could do, something they could control, no matter how small. But home cures were just the beginning. People believed in signs. A sudden illness might be blamed on a bad breeze, what they called miasma. Air that had gone sour somehow, carrying disease into the lungs of anyone unfortunate enough to inhale it. If someone lived too close to a swamp, or if the wind came from the wrong direction, that was enough to make people wary. They'd hang dried herbs near windows to clean the air. They might burn sage, or rosemary, or even bits of sulfur to drive out the sickness. Some believed you'd gotten sick because you'd done something wrong, maybe not in this moment, but somewhere along the line. That maybe God was angry. That sin had weakened your soul and left your body vulnerable. A cough might be punishment. A fever might be a sign that your thoughts had wandered into places they shouldn't have gone. People were often urged to pray, to confess, to ask forgiveness, not just for peace of mind, but because they truly believed it might heal the body too. Others thought illness came from curses, or from the evil eye. A jealous neighbor who looked at your healthy family with envy, a passing stranger who muttered something under their breath, a dream you couldn't remember that left you waking up sick. In rural areas especially, people sometimes called on cunning folk or wise women, unofficial healers who used charms and spells, who claimed to know which herbs to crush and which words to speak when the sickness refused to leave. There were people who would lay knives under the bed to cut the fever out of a person, who would place an egg in a bowl beside the bed and watch for signs that the spirit of the illness had moved into it, who would tie a piece of red string around the wrist to keep evil from entering through the fingers, who would say certain psalms over and over until their voice went hoarse, believing that words had weight, that the sound itself might push the sickness away. People didn't divide the world the way we do now. They didn't always draw clear lines between science, medicine, belief, and magic. Everything was mixed together, a long recipe of desperation and hope. You used what you had, and you prayed for the rest. In wealthier homes, remedies might be written down. Recipes for tonics and tinctures that were passed from mother to daughter, scrawled in careful handwriting in a household book kept next to the hearth. Things like treacle mixed with brandy, or boiled wormwood with lemon and sugar, or powdered rhubarb mixed with wine. In poor homes, the remedies were carried in memory. An old man who remembered what his grandfather used for stomach pain. A neighbor who said her sister beat a fever with mustard foot baths and elderberry syrup. But none of it came with instructions. No dosage charts. No guarantees. You just tried. You did what you could. You gave the child the same dose you gave the adult. You repeated the treatment every hour, or every day, or just until they started to look better, or stopped breathing. And there were risks. Some home remedies were dangerous. Some made things worse. People drank mercury and arsenic without realizing the damage it was doing. They used lead-based creams for rashes. They rubbed raw tobacco on wounds or inhaled fumes from burning camphor and sulfur. The line between remedy and poison was thin, and it was easy to cross without even knowing it. But no one had better options. So when you were sick in the 1700s, you laid there and waited while your family gathered what they could. A jar of something sour. A cloth soaked in spirits. A whispered prayer. Maybe they tied garlic to your wrist or stuffed dried lavender into your pillowcase. Maybe someone rubbed pig fat on your chest. Maybe you drank water mixed with ashes or chewed on tree bark. You didn't ask questions. You couldn't afford to. You swallowed what they gave you. You closed your eyes when they told you to. You lay still and hoped that something, anything, would pull you back toward health. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. But even if it didn't work, they'd keep trying. Because in the 1700s, doing something, even if it made no sense, still felt better than doing nothing. If you were sick and things got worse, if the pain in your side became a lump, or a fever left something swollen or oozing, or an accident turned into infection, sometimes the only hope left was surgery. But the word surgery didn't mean what it does today. It wasn't clean. It wasn't safe. It didn't happen in a hospital with beeping machines and quiet staff. Surgery in the 1700s was brutal, primitive, and terrifying. And most people would do almost anything to avoid it. There were no anesthetics. That's the first thing. No one put you to sleep. No one gave you a clean, painless escape from what was about to happen. You were wide awake, fully aware, and expected to stay still while someone cut into your body. Sometimes they gave you strong alcohol. Maybe a cloth soaked in laudanum or a little opium if they had any. But even then, the pain hit fast and deep. Screaming was normal. Biting down on leather or wood was common. The faster the surgeon was, the better, because every second was another second of agony. Surgeons back then weren't always doctors. In fact, many weren't trained in what we think of as medicine at all. Barbers often doubled as surgeons. They cut hair, pulled teeth, drained boils, and sometimes even amputated limbs. They were called barber surgeons, and they carried sharp blades not only for grooming, but for cutting into human flesh. Some learned through apprenticeship, watching someone else work, then trying it themselves. There were no formal tests, no boards, no licenses that guaranteed skill. Just a set of tools, a willingness to cut, and a patient desperate enough to let them. The tools were basic. Bone saws, knives, hooks, forceps, scissors, needles. Most were made of iron or steel, reused over and over again. They weren't sterile. There was no understanding of bacteria or cross-contamination. A knife used on one patient might be used on another without even being wiped clean. Some surgeons would dip blades in alcohol or flame them briefly, but these were small gestures against a world of infection. Rust was common. Blood stayed crusted in the joints. There were no gloves, no clean gowns, no masks. The idea of sterilization simply didn't exist yet. If you needed something removed, a tumor, an infected limb, a bullet, or even a bladder stone, you had two options, surgery or death. And sometimes, even with surgery, the end result was the same. Amputations were among the most common procedures. Infected wounds or severe injuries often left no other choice. Once gangrene set in, the only hope was to cut the limb off before the infection spread through the blood and killed the person. But this wasn't simple. You'd be laid down, maybe tied to a bench or held down by family members. The surgeon would sharpen his tools as you watched. He'd offer you liquor or a leather strap. And then he'd begin, quickly sawing through skin, muscle, and bone, working as fast as possible. Some could remove a leg in under 3 minutes. The faster, the better, because the longer it took, the more likely the patient would die from shock or simply bleed out. There were no transfusions. No fours. Blood loss was constant and often fatal. Tourniquets might be used to slow bleeding, and stitches were crude but essential. Cauterizing was also common, heating metal until it was red hot, then pressing it to the wound to seal the blood vessels shut. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. The screams echoed. And sometimes, people passed out from the pain alone. Recovery was uncertain. Even if the surgery itself went well, infection could set in. Pus, fever, swelling. People called it hospital fever or surgical rot. Today, we'd call it sepsis. Without antibiotics, there was nothing to do but wait and hope the body could fight it off on its own. Sometimes wounds were packed with cloth or herbs. Sometimes they were left open to drain. Sometimes maggots were welcomed into the wound because they ate dead tissue and helped keep infection at bay. But often, nothing helped. A person could survive the cutting and still die days later from something no one could see or stop. And then there were the other surgeries, removing bladder stones through the perineum, a horrifying procedure called lithotomy that left many men permanently damaged or killed. There were also attempts at trepanation, where holes were drilled into the skull to relieve pressure or release bad spirits. Without understanding what caused seizures, headaches, or madness, doctors sometimes cut into the head in ways that did more harm than good. Women suffered too. Complicated childbirths often ended in death for the mother or baby. If the baby was stuck, there were crude instruments used to pull it out, forceps that sometimes crushed the infant's skull. Midwives and doctors alike had little understanding of anatomy, and worse, they didn't wash their hands. They'd go from handling a cadaver or a sick patient straight into delivering a child. Puerperal fever, what we now know was caused by infection, killed countless women after childbirth. But back then, people didn't understand why. They just thought it was bad luck. Surgeries were public sometimes. In larger cities, students or curious onlookers might watch as a surgeon worked. There were operating theaters, literally built like stages, where people sat in rows and looked down at a patient lying on a table, stripped and shivering. Every move the surgeon made was on display. There was no privacy, no sedation, no comfort. Just cold instruments, open wounds, and a crowd of strangers. And yet, for many, it was still better than doing nothing. If the infection was too deep, or the tumor too painful, or the limb too rotten to keep, surgery was the only hope left. People faced it with fear, with prayer, with a final goodbye whispered to loved ones before they were taken to the room. They knew the risks. Everyone knew someone who hadn't made it. But there were no good options. You either cut, or you died slowly. It's hard now to even imagine what it felt like. To lie there, knowing what was coming. To feel the first slice of the knife. To hear the saw grinding against your own bone. To smell your own blood in the air, knowing that even if you survived this, you might not survive what came next. But this was life in the 1700s. Pain was part of medicine. Blood was part of healing. And every cut was a gamble between life and death. There's something people today take for granted. How clean things smell when someone's sick. Hospitals smell like disinfectant, like soap and sterile plastic. Even at home, when someone has the flu or a cold, we open windows, spray air freshener, or wipe things down with bleach. We know how to wash our hands. We understand germs. We try to keep sickness contained. But in the 1700s, none of that was part of everyday life. And if you were sick, truly sick, you were trapped in a room that didn't just feel bad. It smelled bad. It smelled terrible. Imagine this. You're lying in a small wooden room. There's no running water, no plumbing, no real ventilation. The windows may not even open. If they do, they might stay closed anyway, because people feared bad air, what they called miasma. They believed that sickness traveled through foul vapors, so letting fresh air in might invite more illness. Instead, the air inside just hung there. Thick, stale, heavy. And as you got sicker, it got worse. Your body doesn't stay clean when it's sick. You sweat. You shiver. You throw up. You might lose control of your bladder or your bowels. Especially if you're very ill. Especially if you can't get out of bed. There's no adult diaper. No waterproof mattress cover. Just rough linens that soak up everything and hold on to it. The stink of fever sweat clings to the sheets. The sour reek of vomit crusts in a bowl under the bed may be forgotten. If someone has to help you relieve yourself, the waste goes into a chamber pot, and if the pot's not emptied right away, it just sits there, adding its own ripe note to the already rancid air. The bed itself might be straw, stuffed with hay or horsehair, laid over wood, and never properly cleaned. It absorbs the smell of sickness and doesn't let go. Pillows might be musty. Blankets might be damp. And no one's washing any of it daily. Maybe not even weekly. Laundry meant hauling water by hand, scrubbing with lye soap, rinsing, wringing, and drying. When someone was deathly ill, cleaning their linens often became the last priority, if it happened at all. Then there's the smell of the person themselves. If you've ever smelled a body running a high fever for days, you know it's not just sweat. It's a sharp, sour smell. A hot, chemical odor that seeps from the pores. If infection sets in, wounds might ooze. Abscesses might break open. Pus has a smell. Blood has a smell. Rotting tissue, especially if someone has gangrene, has a smell that people never forget. It's not just unpleasant. It's revolting. And in a small room with no fresh air and no proper cleaning, it becomes overpowering. Herbal remedies were sometimes used to mask it. People hung dried lavender or rosemary. They burned incense. They placed flowers near the bed. Not because it healed anyone, but because it made the room slightly more bearable for the people sitting inside. In wealthier homes, someone might burn sweet-smelling herbs in a small pan of coals. In poorer homes, people just lived with it. They might open a door for a few minutes, or throw sawdust on the floor to absorb the smells, then sweep it up later. But mostly, they just got used to it, because they had no choice. If the illness dragged on, the smell lingered. The sickroom became a place no one wanted to enter unless they had to. Family members held cloths to their faces. Neighbors dropped things off at the door and left quickly. The room started to feel cursed. Thick with heat and sweat and waste. A space where time slowed down and the air pressed against your skin like wet cloth. And for the person lying in the bed, already miserable with pain or fever or exhaustion, the smells made everything worse. It was hard to eat. Hard to sleep. Hard to even breathe. And if death came, that smell changed again. In those final hours, the body starts to shut down. The breath becomes shallow. The skin gets cold. Organs slow and stop. And as they do, they release gases. Odors. The scent of life letting go. In the 1700s, most people died at home. In that same bed. In that same room. And once they were gone, the windows were sometimes still kept closed, because people feared letting their spirit out. Or feared letting something else in. The body might lie there for hours, even a day, before it was removed. And the room kept all of it. All the air, all the moisture, all the scent of what had happened inside those four walls. If you walked into a sick room in the 1700s, you didn't just see illness, you smelled it. It was in the sheets, the clothes, the wood, the air itself. It was something you couldn't escape. You might try to hold your breath. You might step outside and gasp for fresh air afterward. But it clung to you. It got in your clothes, your hair, your memory, and it reminded you, in a way that words couldn't, just how close death always was. Being sick in the 1700s didn't just mean pain and fever and foul smells. It also meant a complete lack of decent food. When your body was already struggling, already weak and aching and desperate for comfort, the food you were given was often the last thing you wanted. It was bland, mushy, spoiled, or just plain unappetizing. But it was all that was available. Because people didn't know what helped the body heal. They just fed the sick what tradition or superstition told them to. And most of it wasn't nourishing, it was punishment disguised as a meal. If you had a fever or an infection, you'd often be told not to eat much at all. Fasting was common. People believed that food gave strength to the disease, not the person. So they'd starve you, hoping the illness would wither away without fuel. If they did feed you, it would be broths, watery, thin soups made from bones or old vegetables. There was almost no flavor. No salt, no fat, no herbs unless someone happened to have a garden. Meat broth might have a greasy film floating on top, or a sour smell if it had been left out too long. And that was considered good food. Gruels were common too. Oat gruel, barley gruel, rice gruel. Just some grains boiled into mush with water or milk, maybe a little sweetened if honey or sugar could be spared. But most of the time, it was plain. Grey. Sloppy. Served lukewarm. If your stomach was upset, you got it cold. And if your caretaker didn't have much food in the house, even that gruel might be thinned down to the point where it was barely more than flavored water. Sometimes, they'd feed the sick beer or ale instead of water, because water wasn't always safe to drink. It might be drawn from a river or a well near a cesspit, and could make someone even sicker. So people gave small beer, a very weak alcoholic drink, to children, to the elderly, and to the sick. It didn't taste good. It wasn't especially refreshing. But it was safer than water, at least most of the time. In other cases, wine was considered medicinal. You might be given a few sips between spoonfuls of broth to strengthen your blood or warm your spirit. But if you were poor, even that wasn't an option. Food went bad quickly. Without refrigeration, milk soured fast. Meat spoiled unless it was salted, smoked, or dried. Vegetables were seasonal, and fruit was often cooked into preserves if it could be saved at all. So if you were sick in spring, and the winter stores had already run out, there might not be much left. Just a few moldy turnips. Maybe some dried beans. Bread that was days or weeks old, hard as stone, needing to be soaked before it could be chewed. Even the broth might come from bones already boiled once before, used and reused until the water barely changed color. And none of it was served nicely. There were no clean trays, no ceramic bowls with little sprigs of herbs to make things look better. You got a wooden bowl, maybe pewter if you were lucky. A spoon, possibly shared with others. The food might be ladled from a pot that hadn't been properly scrubbed. Maybe it had been sitting on the hearth all day, crusting over, picking up dust and ash. You'd be handed a spoonful or two and told to eat what you could. And if you couldn't? If your stomach turned at the smell or your throat hurt too much to swallow? Too bad. You were considered stubborn. Ungrateful. People didn't understand nausea or appetite loss the way we do now. They thought if you weren't eating, it meant you weren't trying to get better. So sometimes food was forced. Poured in. Pushed between your lips with firm hands and firm voices. They thought they were helping. Some food traditions were based on humoral medicine, the idea that your body had 4 humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and food could balance or unbalance them. If you were too hot, they gave you cooling foods like cucumber or barley water. If you were too cold, you might get spiced wine or onions. But none of this was rooted in biology as we understand it. It was a guessing game. A lot of it tasted awful. And if it made you sicker, people often assumed it was just the disease fighting back. And remember, someone had to cook this food. Usually a mother, a sister, an aging grandmother, or a tired neighbor. They weren't trained. They weren't professionals. They were just doing what they could with what they had, which sometimes meant boiling an old bone for the 3rd time, or scraping the mold off bread, or mixing a powder into your drink because they'd heard it helped a friend of a friend. The care was real. The love was there. But the meals didn't bring comfort. They were just one more reminder that you were sick, and that the world around you didn't know how to help. Even when you got a little better, the food didn't change much. You weren't allowed to eat what you wanted. Spices were seen as dangerous for the sick. So were fresh fruits, especially citrus. People believed that sharp foods could worsen your condition. So you'd be told no apples, no oranges, no pepper, no ginger, just more boiled grain, more mush, more stale bread, and always undercooked, underseasoned, and unappetizing. For those without a strong stomach, or without help, the result was often starvation. People just wasted away. They weren't eating enough to rebuild strength. They weren't getting vitamins or minerals. They had no understanding of nutrition. They just kept serving what was easy, what was traditional, what didn't take too much from the already limited pantry. And in the end, the body gave up. So there you were, shivering in a bed, weak and miserable, surrounded by the smell of sweat and sickness, and staring down at a bowl of lukewarm sludge that might have been gruel, or broth, or something halfway between. And that was supposed to make you feel better. That was supposed to give you strength. That was medicine, in the only form some people could afford. But more often than not, it just made being sick feel even worse. Being sick in the 1700s didn't just hurt your body, it stripped away your dignity. At a time when privacy was rare for anyone, it was almost completely gone when you fell ill. The walls around you were thin. The rooms were crowded. The space you had, whether you lived in a cottage or a larger home, wasn't really your own. There were no private hospital beds. No curtains to pull around you. No quiet corners to suffer in peace. You were out in the open, vulnerable, and completely exposed. For most people, homes were small and cramped. Families lived together in tight quarters. Parents, children, grandparents, sometimes even cousins or neighbors under one roof. 1 or 2 rooms might be all you had. And if someone got sick, the family didn't clear out to give them space. They simply made room where they could. A sick child might lie in the same bed as a sibling. A sick mother might rest on a bench in the kitchen. A feverish husband might lie groaning just feet away from the fire, while people continued their chores, cooked meals, and walked past him constantly. There was no bedroom in the modern sense for many people. No room you could retreat to and close the door behind you. At best, there might be a small sleeping area or a shared bed. And even if you had your own room, it wasn't soundproof. Voices, footsteps, coughing, crying, all of it filled the house at all hours. And if you were the one lying there sick, you were never alone. You could hear everything, see everything, smell everything, and feel completely trapped in your own body while life carried on around you. Being sick stripped away your modesty. There were no hospital gowns or clean linens to change into. You wore the same clothes, maybe for days, until someone had the time, or the energy, to change them. If you couldn't bathe yourself, someone else had to do it. And that someone wasn't a trained nurse. It was usually a family member. Maybe a spouse. Maybe a daughter. Maybe a neighbor doing a favor. They might help you to the chamber pot. They might wash your body, bit by bit, with cold water and a rag. They might spoon broth into your mouth or clean up after you when you couldn't hold it in. And the whole time, you could feel their eyes on you. Their hands on your skin. Their sighs when they were tired or frustrated. You felt like a burden, even if no one said it out loud. You felt embarrassed. Powerless. Some people apologized constantly while sick. Others just stopped speaking. It was easier than trying to explain how uncomfortable and exposed they felt. Even at night, when you'd expect peace, privacy was still impossible. If you were lucky enough to have your own bed, it might still be in the same room as your entire family. Every cough, every wheeze, every time you tried to roll over and winced in pain, it was heard by everyone. If you moaned in your sleep, they heard it. If you cried, they heard that too. Some might offer help. Others just got used to the sounds and stopped reacting. The sickness became part of the household rhythm. And it wasn't just physical privacy that disappeared, it was emotional privacy too. Your pain became everyone's business. People talked about it openly. She's not doing well. He was up all night vomiting. I don't think he'll make it. You'd hear these things while you were still alive, still conscious. Sometimes they were said in the same room. Sometimes whispered just outside the door, but loud enough to catch a word or two. Strangers might come by to check on you, not always out of kindness. Some were curious. Others were nosy. A neighbor might stop in just to see if you were still breathing. A local healer might poke and prod you without explanation. You were seen and discussed, but not consulted. People made decisions for you, what you would eat, who would care for you, whether to call a doctor or a priest. You didn't get to choose. You didn't have a say. In wealthier homes, things might have looked different on the surface. You might have had a separate room, maybe even a servant to care for you. But the privacy was still limited. The servant came and went. The household talked. Gossip traveled fast. If you had a terrible cough, or if your illness was seen as scandalous or shameful, like something affecting the body in private ways, people whispered. Even if they didn't say it to your face, you knew. The walls had ears. The halls carried every word. And comfort? That was even harder to come by. Comfort meant more than a soft pillow or a warm blanket. It meant feeling safe. It meant being allowed to rest without worry or embarrassment. But most people didn't have that luxury. Beds were often hard. Pillows were stuffed with straw. Blankets might be scratchy or damp. And if there weren't enough to go around, others in the household might need them more. The fire in the hearth didn't reach every corner of the house. And if wood was scarce, it didn't stay lit all night. You might lie there cold and alone in the dark, with only your thoughts and your pain. No soft light. No calming music. No nurse to check your pulse and tell you it would be okay. Just the sound of others sleeping. Or maybe arguing. Or praying. And you, too sick to speak. Too sick to move. For all the talk of community and closeness in the 1700s, Being sick often meant being completely isolated in a crowd. You had people near you, yes, but they couldn't really give you what you needed. Not privacy, not comfort, not peace. You were just there, exposed, exhausted, and stuck in a space where your suffering was public, your choices were few, and your dignity slipped away with every passing day. In the 1700s, getting sick didn't just mean feeling bad for a while and then getting better. It meant facing the very real possibility that you might not recover at all. Illness back then often meant death. Even something we'd think of as minor today, a sore throat, a fever, a rash, could turn deadly in just a matter of days. There were no antibiotics, no vaccines, no reliable treatments. If your body couldn't fight off the illness on its own, there really wasn't much anyone could do. And most of the time, it couldn't. People lived with the constant shadow of death, especially when sickness came into the house. One day, someone might be helping in the field, laughing at the table, or rocking a child to sleep. The next day, they were coughing, pale, shaking, unable to get up. And within the week, they could be gone. Sometimes even sooner. Whole families were familiar with this pattern. It wasn't surprising. It was just life. Or, more truthfully, the end of it. When someone in the household got sick, especially if it was serious, there was a kind of quiet dread that settled in. People didn't say it out loud at first, but they thought it. Will they make it? Is this the end? There was no certainty, just waiting, watching, hoping. But hope was fragile, and for many, it was often disappointed. Childhood illnesses were among the worst. Today, children get measles, mumps, chickenpox, whooping cough, and they recover, because there are treatments, vaccines, modern care. Back then, those same diseases were often death sentences. Parents knew that not every child born would live to adulthood. Many didn't even survive their first few years. That meant every fever was terrifying. Every cough could be the start of something fatal. Mothers and fathers watched over their children with desperate eyes, knowing there might be nothing they could do but hold them and wait. And it wasn't just the very young or the very old who died. Healthy adults, people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, could be struck down too. Something like a cut on the hand that became infected, a toothache that led to an abscess, or even the flu during a harsh winter could spiral out of control fast. Without antibiotics or sterile tools, infections spread quickly through the body. One day you had a bit of swelling. The next, your whole arm was red and hot, or your throat was so swollen you couldn't breathe. And death could come fast. Doctors were often called too late, or not at all. And even when they did arrive, they didn't always help. Sometimes they made things worse. Bleeding patients was common, draining blood to try and balance the humors. But if you were already weak, that could kill you faster. Giving strong emetics or purging the bowels was another practice, based on the belief that the sickness had to be expelled. But these cures weakened people even more. So in many cases, illness didn't just lead to death, it pushed people toward it, inch by inch, because the treatments were so harsh. And when a doctor gave up, when he looked at the family and said something like, "I've done all I can," everyone knew what that meant. It was time to call the priest, to start the prayers, to gather the family for one last visit. Sometimes people were lucid in their final moments. They spoke final words, gave blessings, whispered goodbyes. Other times, they drifted in and out of consciousness, their minds clouded by pain, fever, or delirium. And often, death came in the night, while others slept nearby, too tired or too numb to notice right away. There were no hospitals for most people. They died at home, in their beds, or on the floor, or sitting in a chair they could no longer get out of. There were no machines, no monitors, no painkillers. Just slow breathing, then slower, then still. And the moment of death, when it came, was marked by silence. A silence that filled the house, the room, the space around them. And then came the weeping, or the prayers, or, sometimes, just a numb kind of stillness as others tried to grasp the fact that the person they loved was no longer there. People were buried quickly, often the next day. There were no embalming practices for most common folk. The body was washed, sometimes by family, sometimes by neighbors, laid out in a shroud. The funeral was simple. A short service, maybe a wooden box, then into the ground. And that was it. One day alive, the next day gone. No long hospital stays. No medical interventions. Just sickness, suffering, and then silence. It left behind grief, of course, but also fear. Because when someone in your home died from illness, others were at risk too. People didn't know about germs, but they knew sickness could spread. So even while mourning, people worried. Who's next? Will I get it? Will the children be okay? And sometimes the answer was no. Because it wasn't uncommon for a mother and child to die within days of each other, or for siblings to fall ill one after another. Whole families could be wiped out in a single season. There was also a spiritual fear that came with death. Some believed that sickness was a punishment from God, that if you died from illness, it was because you had sinned. Others thought that the way you died affected what happened to your soul. If you suffered too much, it meant you hadn't been absolved, or that you were still clinging to worldly things. That added another layer of terror to the whole experience, especially if you were too weak to confess, or if the priest didn't arrive in time. So being sick wasn't just a battle for your body. It was a battle for your soul, your dignity, and your place in the world beyond. And the odds were stacked against you. Death from illness was common. Expected. It happened in every town, every village, every family. People lived with the memory of it constantly. Parents buried children, spouses buried each other. Children grew up remembering the sounds of someone dying in the room beside them. It wasn't rare. It wasn't surprising. It was just part of life. But it never got easier. It always hurt. Always felt like something stolen too soon. That's what it meant to be sick in the 1700s. Not just pain. Not just discomfort. But the quiet, growing knowledge that this illness might be the one that ends everything. And that there might be nothing anyone could do to stop it. When someone got sick in the 1700s, the people around them didn't always respond with sympathy. In fact, it was common for sick people to be blamed for their illness or avoided entirely. This wasn't just about fear, though fear played a big role. It was also about misunderstanding, superstition, and the hard truth that people simply didn't want to risk getting sick themselves. Without knowing how disease truly spread, people made up explanations. And those explanations often pointed straight at the sick person. Sometimes, it was seen as a moral failure. People believed that illness might be a punishment for bad behavior, sinful living, or angering God. If someone got sick, it wasn't just unfortunate, it could be seen as shameful. The idea was that they must have done something wrong to deserve it. Maybe they drank too much. Maybe they skipped church. Maybe they argued with their neighbors. And now they were being punished. This belief wasn't limited to one village or one country. It was common across many cultures at the time. The result? Instead of being cared for, the sick might be judged or even shunned. And when a disease spread fast, like during a smallpox outbreak or an influenza wave, people's fear often turned into outright cruelty. Neighbors stopped visiting. Friends kept their distance. Even family members sometimes refused to care for their own sick relatives. Doors were closed. Windows were nailed shut. Food might be left outside, but no one came inside. People would whisper about the sick behind their backs, assuming they had brought the illness on themselves somehow. Sometimes whole families were blamed. If one person got sick, the entire household might be treated like a threat. It wasn't just about blame, though, it was also survival. Without knowing what caused disease, people made desperate guesses. Some thought it was the air, bad smells or miasmas that carried illness. Others believed it was caused by being near someone who was corrupted or cursed. That meant staying away from the sick wasn't just selfish, it was seen as smart. People believed that avoiding a sick person was the best way to protect themselves and their children. And sometimes, that meant abandoning the very people who needed the most help. Even caregivers weren't immune to suspicion. If someone volunteered to look after the sick, others might look at them strangely. Why would they take such a risk? Were they already sick themselves? Or were they somehow responsible for spreading disease? Midwives, gravediggers, and herbal healers often walked a fine line between being useful and being feared. A midwife who attended to a woman who died in childbirth might find herself accused of bringing bad luck. A healer whose patient didn't survive might be called a witch. And once those whispers started, it was hard to make them stop. In towns and cities, the blame could grow into full panic. When epidemics hit, authorities sometimes responded by locking up entire buildings, forcing the sick to stay inside with no way out. Guards might be posted at the doors. Signs might be painted to warn others to stay away. These households became like little prisons, full of fear, sickness, and isolation. People on the outside were terrified of catching whatever was inside. And people on the inside knew that help might never come. No visitors. No priest. No doctor. Just waiting. In rural areas, it could be even worse. Villages were smaller, and everyone knew each other. When someone got sick, everyone talked. If someone died, people watched the house closely. If more people got sick, blame started to spread. Maybe it was something in their well. Maybe their animals were cursed. Maybe their home was built on bad ground. Maybe they had done something that brought the illness into the community. Fear and rumor had a way of turning neighbors into enemies. Even long after someone recovered, they might still be treated differently. People remembered who had been sick. They avoided shaking hands, sharing food, or sitting too close. A person who had survived a serious illness might carry that label with them for years. It was as if the sickness had stained them somehow, made them unclean in the eyes of others. For those who had lost loved ones, the pain of grief was often made worse by the coldness of the people around them. It wasn't enough to suffer through the illness, you also had to live with the judgment. This treatment made illness even harder to endure. Imagine being so weak you could barely move, your body aching, your skin burning with fever, and knowing that people were blaming you for it. Imagine your neighbors whispering behind their curtains, afraid to come near. Imagine your friends staying away, your church saying nothing, your own family keeping their distance. The loneliness would be just as painful as the illness itself. And this isolation wasn't just emotional. It had practical consequences. If no one visited, no one brought food. If no one helped, your fire might go out. Your water might run low. You might lie in bed, unable to get up, with no one to wash your face, change your bedding, or speak a kind word. Days passed in silence. Nights stretched on, endless and dark. And if you died, it might be a while before anyone even noticed. All of this created a cycle of fear. People avoided the sick because they were afraid. The sick suffered alone. And when others saw how miserable that was, they became even more afraid of ever getting sick themselves. So they blamed the sick, kept their distance, and in doing so, made the suffering even worse. It was a world where compassion was often overshadowed by panic. Where fear made people cruel, and sickness didn't just hurt the body, it hurt the heart too. Getting sick in the 1700s wasn't something you bounced back from in a few days. For most people, if you were lucky enough to survive an illness, that was only the beginning of a long, exhausting road. Recovery was slow. And a lot of the time, it was never really complete. Your body didn't just go back to normal. You didn't just wake up one morning and feel like yourself again. More often than not, you carried the effects of that illness with you for the rest of your life, if you lived long enough to notice the difference. There were no modern medicines to speed up healing. No vitamins. No protein shakes. No carefully balanced diets or personalized health advice. Once the fever passed or the rash faded or the coughing died down, you were still weak, bone deep, soul-tired kind of weak. The kind that made it hard to stand up, let alone walk across the room or lift a pail of water. But life didn't stop for recovery. Chores still needed doing. Animals still needed feeding. Firewood still needed chopping. You were expected to push through, even if every step felt like wading through thick mud. And if you had suffered something serious, like smallpox, typhus, or pneumonia, you might not even be the same person anymore, physically or mentally. Some people lost their eyesight after certain illnesses. Others were left with joint pain, tremors, or strange chronic fatigue. Some children who recovered from high fevers ended up with developmental issues that no one knew how to treat. If you'd had surgery, especially something crude like an amputation, your life afterward was full of complications. Infection might linger, or the wound might reopen. Even if you avoided those dangers, you still had to adjust to living with a part of your body missing. What made recovery harder was the lack of proper food, warmth, and rest. Most homes didn't have soft beds or fluffy pillows. They had lumpy mattresses stuffed with straw, rough woolen blankets, and drafty walls that let in cold air. The fire might die out during the night. Your muscles would ache from the chill. You'd wake up shivering, soaked in sweat, or coughing again. And there were no real comforts. No hot showers. No painkillers. Just time, and more time, and the slow, uncertain hope that your body might knit itself back together. Rest wasn't always possible either. In fact, it rarely was. Poor families couldn't afford to have one less set of hands helping out, especially during busy seasons like harvest or winter preparation. If you could sit up, you could sew. If you could walk, you could carry wood. If you could breathe, you could stir the soup. Even children who had just been sick were expected to get back to chores the moment they could stand. And sometimes, that pushed them right back into illness. The body wasn't ready, but the world didn't wait. Another problem was reinfection. Because no one really understood how diseases worked, people recovering from one illness might get exposed to another without warning. Or, worse, the same illness might come back in a second wave. A cold became bronchitis. A rash became an ulcer. An infection that seemed gone suddenly roared back twice as strong. People often thought they were healed, only to fall sick all over again. And with each relapse, the body got weaker. That made true recovery feel more like a pause than a turning point. You were always just one bad day away from sliding backward. Even mental recovery was a struggle. Being sick for weeks, or months, took a toll on the mind. People became anxious, irritable, or distant. Long nights of fever and pain changed people. The fear of dying stayed with them. The memory of being alone in the dark, listening to their own labored breathing, never fully went away. It wasn't unusual for people to feel haunted after surviving a bad illness. Not just by the experience itself, but by the people they had seen die. A parent, a sibling, a child who didn't make it. That kind of grief settled deep inside and shaped the rest of their life. And then there was the social side of it. People who had been very sick often returned to their communities different. Maybe they walked with a limp. Maybe they had scars. Maybe their minds were slower, or their speech less clear. These changes didn't go unnoticed. Some were treated with pity. Others were avoided. Some even lost jobs or marriage prospects because of the way their illness had changed them. Sickness wasn't just a private thing, it left a public mark, and not everyone was kind about it. Plus, there was always the looming possibility that you never actually got better. That your recovery was really just a new kind of suffering. A weaker version of the life you had before. People didn't use terms like chronic illness or long-term effects, but they lived with them just the same. A cough that never went away. Joints that ached when it rained. A stomach that couldn't handle normal meals anymore. They didn't always know why these things happened, but they accepted them, grudgingly, wearily, as the price of survival. This kind of incomplete recovery often led to early aging. People in their 40s looked like they were in their 60s. Their backs were bent. Their faces lined. Their movements stiff and slow. They had survived sickness, but it had carved years off their lives. And sometimes, those around them treated them as half-broken, not quite whole anymore. The strength they once had was gone, and no one expected it to come back. They were reminded of it daily, in the mirror, in the way people looked at them, in the work they could no longer do. For the poor, recovery was even worse. If you had no money, you had no means to rebuild your strength. No extra food, no soft bed, no quiet place to rest. If you were sick and poor, you had to get back on your feet fast, no matter how you felt. Because if you didn't work, you didn't eat. And if you didn't recover fully, you just learned to live with the damage. You didn't get a second chance. You didn't get a recovery period. You just kept going, or you didn't. So when people in the 1700s got sick, even if they survived, they paid a steep price. Their bodies never felt the same. Their lives were altered. Recovery wasn't a return to normal, it was just a slow adjustment to a new kind of struggle. And it reminded them that health was fragile, fleeting, and never something to be taken for granted. Even something that would seem small today, a sore throat, a light fever, a cough that lingers for a few days, could turn deadly in the 1700s. Back then, people didn't have the medical safety nets we rely on now. No antibiotics to knock out infections, no access to 4 fluids, number 24-hour hospitals. So when something went wrong, even if it started out as just a little sniffle or a mild stomachache, it could easily spiral out of control and take someone's life within days. A simple cut from working in the garden or chopping firewood could get infected. Without antiseptics or proper wound care, it might swell, turn red, and ooze pus. If it wasn't cleaned properly, which it often wasn't, bacteria could spread into the bloodstream. What we now call sepsis was a death sentence back then. And there were no warning labels, no blood tests, no emergency room. People would just grow weaker, feverish, confused. Some would hallucinate. Others would fall into a coma. And once that happened, there wasn't anything anyone could do. Respiratory infections were another big danger. What started as a little cough might settle into the chest. In those days, there wasn't really a word for bronchitis or pneumonia the way we use it now. They'd call it a chest cold or a lung fever. But regardless of the name, it was serious. Without antibiotics or oxygen support, the lungs would fill with fluid. Breathing became difficult. The body would grow exhausted from the effort of just staying alive. People would sit propped up in bed, trying to catch their breath, day after day, until eventually, they either turned a corner, or didn't. Fevers were terrifying. Not just because of what they meant, but because they could last for weeks and leave people utterly drained. A simple flu could knock someone out of commission for a month or more. And there were no ice packs, no fever reducers like acetaminophen or ibuprofen. The best you could do was cool cloths and hope your body held out. And sometimes, the fever would climb so high that it caused seizures or brain damage, especially in children. Families would try to sponge someone down with cold water, or place them by an open window. But none of that could truly lower a dangerously high temperature. Even digestive issues, like diarrhea or vomiting, could kill. Food and water were often contaminated. People didn't understand bacteria, so they didn't boil water or wash their hands the way we do today. If someone got a stomach bug or food poisoning, they could become dangerously dehydrated in just a day or two. Without clean water or electrolyte solutions, the body would quickly weaken. Muscles would cramp. The heart would strain. People would become dizzy and confused. And then they'd slip away, often quietly, because no one knew what to do except pray and wait. And then there were illnesses like measles, mumps, and chickenpox. Most people caught them as children, and many survived, but not all. A lot depended on luck and timing. If a child was already weak from hunger or another sickness, one of those common diseases could push them over the edge. A rash could become infected. A fever could climb too high. Measles could cause blindness. Mumps could make it hard to eat or breathe. And all of it was made worse by the fact that there were no pediatricians, no urgent care clinics, no vaccines to prevent the sickness in the first place. To make matters worse, the symptoms of different illnesses often looked the same. A fever could mean a cold, or it could mean smallpox. A cough might be from dust, or it might be the start of tuberculosis. People didn't have thermometers or stethoscopes. Diagnosis was guesswork. So when someone got sick, even with a minor illness, no one knew what was really going on or how serious it would become. Sometimes a person would seem to be improving, and then suddenly take a turn for the worse. They'd stop eating, stop talking, drift into sleep and never wake up. That uncertainty made every illness frightening. You couldn't tell if something was going to pass or if it was going to kill you. Families would gather around a sickbed, watching closely, not knowing whether they were witnessing a recovery or a death. It was a horrible waiting game. People would whisper, light candles, send for the local priest. They didn't know what was happening, but they knew it could end badly. And they had seen it happen before. The memory of a neighbor or a child who died suddenly was never far away. People lived in a constant state of low-level dread, not just of the major plagues or deadly epidemics, but of the little things. A sore throat in the winter, a fever in a newborn, a strange rash on the arm. These weren't shrugged off or taken lightly. They were treated with fear and urgency, because families knew the stakes. They had lost people to less. Maybe a cousin who died after a cold. Maybe a sister who never woke up after catching a simple fever. Every minor illness carried a shadow of something worse. And the burden wasn't just physical. It was emotional, too. Parents had to watch their children closely and often felt powerless. Husbands worried about wives, and wives worried about husbands. Siblings watched each other with nervous eyes. Every sneeze, every cough, every complaint of feeling unwell was like a bell tolling in the distance, an early warning that something might be coming, and there might be nothing to stop it. What made it even more heartbreaking was that people had very few tools to fight back. A hot broth, a few herbs, a damp cloth. That was about it. There was no real way to intervene. No prescriptions. No professional care. They had to trust in nature and hope their body was strong enough. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it wasn't. So the next time you think of a runny nose or a scratchy throat as just an inconvenience, remember, back in the 1700s, that might have been the start of the end. A minor illness wasn't minor at all. It was a threat, one that hovered constantly over people's lives, waiting for a moment of weakness. And once it took hold, there was no guarantee it would let go. Being poor in the 1700s was already hard enough, but being poor and sick, that was a different level of misery. For wealthy people, there was at least a sliver of a chance that help might come. Maybe a doctor could be paid to visit. Maybe they had a servant who could run and fetch something from the apothecary. Maybe they had enough clean bedding, or someone who could stay by their side through the long nights. But poor people had none of that. Getting sick when you were already struggling to survive meant you were now falling through the cracks of a system that barely noticed you in the first place. For most poor families, there was no spare room to lie down in and rest. The sick had to curl up in the same shared space as everyone else. Maybe it was a drafty little cottage. Maybe it was a crowded tenement in a city. Either way, you had no space of your own. The children might still be playing nearby. Someone was always cooking or working or coughing. There was no peace, no quiet. And if you needed to sleep, you'd probably be doing so on a thin mattress stuffed with straw, if you were lucky. Sometimes it was just a pile of old rags or a corner on the floor. And while the wealthy had access to doctors, even if those doctors weren't very effective, poor people didn't even have the option. Medical care cost money. A house call could cost more than a family earned in a week. Poor people couldn't afford tonics, leeches, salves, or herbal mixtures from a trained apothecary. So instead, they were left with what little they had on hand, water, maybe some bread, and whatever plants they could find growing nearby. Sometimes they'd try old family recipes or pass down remedies that may or may not do anything. Sometimes those things helped. Often, they didn't. Even getting water to care for the sick could be hard. In poor neighborhoods, water didn't always come from a clean well or a private pump. It might come from a muddy stream shared by animals. It might be carried in from miles away, in heavy buckets that strained your back and spilled half their contents along the way. And the water itself might be filthy, full of waste, bacteria, and things no one could see, but that still made people sicker. Boiling it required firewood or coal, which cost money too. So people took their chances, even when they knew it might make the illness worse. And what about food? There wasn't much of that, either. Poor families already lived on scraps, bread that had gone stale, root vegetables, maybe some porridge if oats were available. Meat was rare. Milk spoiled fast. Fruits were seasonal and unaffordable. So when someone got sick and needed something light and nourishing to eat, like broth or fresh food, there was nothing like that to give them. Sometimes they had to go hungry. Sometimes they had to eat whatever the rest of the family was eating, whether it was appropriate or not. And if the person was too sick to eat on their own, well, not everyone had someone to feed them by hand. There also weren't enough people to take care of the sick. In rich households, you might have a maid, a servant, or even a nurse who could sit by the bed and keep watch. In poor homes, everyone had to work. There were fields to plow, bread to bake, clothes to mend. If someone got sick, the rest of the family couldn't just stop everything. They might check in between chores, but they couldn't sit there for hours holding a hand or cooling a fever. And sometimes, there was no one at all. A sick mother might have to take care of her own children even while struggling to breathe. A sick laborer might still be expected to show up at work, or risk losing his only income. And if the illness lingered, there were no safety nets. No sick pay. No community clinics. No insurance. Missing too many days of work meant falling behind on rent or being unable to afford food. People who stayed sick too long could be evicted, thrown out onto the streets, left to fend for themselves. That's how quickly sickness could snowball into disaster when you were poor. You'd start with a cough, and end up hungry, homeless, and alone within a few weeks. And then, of course, there was the stigma. Poor people weren't just ignored when they got sick, they were often blamed for it. Wealthier people believed that illness came from bad smells and filth, and since poor neighborhoods were crowded and dirty, they assumed that poor people were the cause of many diseases. Some even believed the poor deserved to be sick because of their laziness or immorality. So if a disease broke out, it was often poor communities that were blamed and isolated. Sometimes whole streets were blocked off. Sometimes families were left to die in their homes, with no one willing to come help. And the worst part was, poor people had seen it happen before. They'd seen neighbors disappear after a long illness. They'd seen children waste away with no food or care. They knew that once you got sick, really sick, there was a good chance you weren't getting better. And they knew there wasn't anything they could do about it. You couldn't call for help. You couldn't pay for a cure. You just had to lie there and hope your body was strong enough to fight it off, even when everything around you made it harder. And when death came, even that was unfair. Wealthy families had funerals, coffins, candles, and prayers. Poor people had to scrape together whatever they could. Sometimes the body was buried quickly, with no ceremony. Sometimes it wasn't buried at all for days. Sometimes the sick person died alone, and no one even noticed right away. That was the harsh, unrelenting truth of being poor and sick in the 1700s. You suffered more, and you died more, and the world moved on without blinking. People in the 1700s didn't understand germs, not in the way we do today. The very idea that tiny, invisible creatures could be floating in the air or clinging to your hands or hiding in your food was completely unknown to most people. There was no concept of bacteria, no knowledge of viruses, and no understanding of how disease actually spread from one person to another. Instead, folks believed in all kinds of other theories, most of them totally wrong, but accepted as fact because no one had anything better to go on. One of the most common beliefs back then was the idea of miasma, which was the theory that bad air, especially foul-smelling air, caused disease. People thought that rotting garbage, sewage, swamp fumes, and other nasty odors could make you sick just by breathing them in. And to be fair, some of those places were full of bacteria and did make people sick, but not because of the smell. They didn't know that, though. They thought if a place stank, then it must be the smell itself that was poisonous. So people would try to protect themselves from miasmas in all kinds of ways. They might carry around little sachets filled with herbs or flowers to clean the air near their nose. Some even wore masks stuffed with strong-smelling substances like vinegar-soaked cloth or dried lavender. These weren't just for decoration. They believed these things could block the bad air from getting into their lungs. Doctors, especially during plagues, would walk around with beak-like masks stuffed with herbs, thinking the smell would keep them safe. And while it didn't help at all with germs, people truly believed it did. Because no one understood germs, hygiene was incredibly poor by modern standards. Washing hands wasn't common practice, especially not before eating or after using the chamber pot. People didn't see the point. If your hands looked clean, they were considered clean. The same applied to dishes, bedding, clothes, and tools. Most people didn't scrub them often, if at all, and when they did, it was usually just a quick rinse with water. Soap was expensive and not used daily. Disinfectants didn't exist. And since no one knew germs even existed, there was no reason to try to kill them. Doctors didn't wash their hands between patients. Surgeons would go from one bloody operation to the next with the same instruments and the same filthy apron, believing that the stains were a badge of experience rather than a risk to life. They might use a rag to wipe a wound and then use that same rag on the next patient. Nobody thought this was dangerous, because they couldn't see any harm. There were no microscopes in daily medical use. No one had looked down into a drop of water and seen it crawling with life. That would come much later. Because they didn't understand germs, people often blamed the wrong things for getting them sick. They might say someone had fallen ill because of bad blood, or because they'd eaten the wrong food at the wrong time of year. Others thought it was caused by sudden changes in weather, or too much dampness in the walls of their house. Some even believed in curses, or thought disease was a punishment from God. So instead of doing things that might have helped, like isolating sick people properly, or cleaning contaminated water, they did things that had no effect at all. They might burn incense, or throw vinegar on the floor, or pray. And when a disease did strike, the confusion only deepened. Imagine someone coughing blood, covered in fever, and everyone around them thinking it was caused by foul air or a bad temper. They wouldn't think to clean the bedding or open a window. They wouldn't understand that the water pitcher nearby might be contaminated. And so the disease would spread, silently and invisibly, through handshakes, shared food, or even just breathing close to someone. Whole households would go down one after another, and no one would understand why. Public health was practically non-existent. There were no health inspectors or sanitation departments. Waste was dumped into rivers and streets. Animals wandered freely, leaving droppings everywhere. Food markets were chaotic and unsanitary, with spoiled meat, flies, and no refrigeration. People sold milk that had gone sour, bread with mold on it, and fish that was already rotting. If someone got sick after eating it, they didn't blame germs, they blamed the weather or their own bad luck. Water sources were also filthy. In many towns and cities, people drank straight from rivers or wells that were contaminated with human waste. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid spread like wildfire. But again, no one knew the true cause. They might build a church to pray for deliverance. They might light candles or wear charms. They might blame immigrants or strangers or even the poor for bringing the disease. But they wouldn't boil the water or clean the sewage, because they didn't know they needed to. It's not that people were foolish. They were just working with the limited knowledge they had. Without science, without microscopes, without the concept of germs, people filled in the blanks the best they could. And they paid the price. Millions died from preventable diseases, diseases we now understand, contain, and even cure, because no one had the tools to see what was really happening. They lived in a world full of invisible killers and had no idea they were even there. And perhaps the saddest part was that they often blamed themselves or each other for getting sick. Without a proper explanation, fear took over. Superstition filled the gap left by science. And because germs are invisible, people believed anything and everything could be the cause, except what was actually making them ill. Doctors in the 1700s worked with tools that were, by today's standards, shockingly basic and often downright ineffective. The instruments they carried were crude, handmade, and sometimes repurposed from other uses. There were no sterile conditions, no disposable gloves, and certainly no high-tech machines or diagnostic devices to help them figure out what was wrong. What they had were a few sharp knives, saws, forceps, and a handful of blunt tools, many of which were designed more to cut than to heal. For example, if someone needed surgery, a rare and dangerous choice back then, the doctor might use a bone saw or a large knife to remove a limb. There was no anesthesia to dull the pain, so the patient was wide awake, screaming, and struggling to stay still while the surgeon hacked away. The tools themselves were often poorly made and not cleaned between patients. Instruments might be wiped on a dirty cloth or rinsed quickly in water, but there was no concept of sterilization. This meant infections were common, and many people died after surgery not from the original injury or disease, but from the infection that followed. Even for simpler treatments, tools were crude. Bloodletting was a popular practice, where doctors used lancets or specialized knives called fleams to cut a vein and drain blood, believing it would balance the body's humors. They also used leeches to suck blood directly from the skin. These tools needed to be sharp and quick, but often they weren't. A dull blade could tear rather than cut, causing unnecessary pain and increasing the risk of infection. Other tools included cupping glasses, small glass cups heated with fire and placed on the skin to create suction. This was thought to draw out bad humors or toxins, but in reality, it left painful bruises and sometimes burns. Doctors also used various hooks, clamps, and probes to explore wounds or extract foreign objects, but these could cause more damage than good. There were no stethoscopes to listen to a patient's lungs or heart, no thermometers to take temperatures accurately, no microscopes to analyze samples. Diagnoses were based mostly on observation and guesswork. Doctors looked at the patient's complexion, their pulse, their urine's color and smell, and their symptoms, then made the best guess they could. Because they didn't understand germs, many treatments were misguided. Sometimes they would prescribe herbal mixtures or purgatives that only made patients weaker. Even the medicines themselves were rudimentary. Apothecaries prepared mixtures from plants and minerals, but often without consistent dosages or quality control. A dose that helped one person might poison another. Without proper tools to measure or administer medicine, the line between treatment and harm was thin. Doctors' tools also reflected the social status of their patients. Wealthier people might have access to slightly better instruments, but for the most part, even the best doctors were limited by what their tools could do. Poor people often saw healers or barber surgeons who had even more basic or worn-out equipment, increasing the risk of botched procedures or misdiagnoses. The lack of effective tools made doctors seem unreliable and even frightening. Many patients feared the instruments themselves, the sharp knives, the saws, the leeches, because they brought pain, and the tools often seemed like weapons rather than aids. This fear, combined with the lack of real cures, meant many people avoided doctors unless absolutely necessary. In truth, the doctors of the 1700s did their best with what they had, but the tools they used were a big reason why medicine was so dangerous and why sickness often led to death. Without better instruments and an understanding of infection, even a simple cut or scrape could become life-threatening. This basic, ineffective toolkit shaped much of the experience of being sick during that time, an experience filled with pain, uncertainty, and fear. Even when people were sick in the 1700s, many of them still had to work. Unlike today, where a person might take days or even weeks off to recover from an illness, back then life rarely allowed for such rest. The demands of survival were relentless, especially for the poor and working class, who made up the majority of the population. Without a steady income or food stores to rely on, missing work could mean starvation or homelessness for both the sick individual and their family. Farming families were particularly hard hit by this reality. If the farmer or farm laborer fell ill during planting or harvest season, there was often no one else to do the work. Fields needed tending, animals had to be fed and cared for, and crops had to be gathered. If the sick person stayed in bed, the whole family might suffer or starve. So, even while weak and feverish, they would force themselves to get up, put on worn-out clothes, and labor through the pain. For those living in towns and cities, the situation was not much better. Artisans, servants, shopkeepers, and laborers had to show up every day or risk losing their livelihood. Employers expected workers to be present, and there were no laws protecting sick leave. If you didn't work, you didn't get paid, and if you didn't get paid, you couldn't buy food or pay rent. This meant many sick people tried to hide their illness, working quietly despite fever, coughing, or stomach pain. They would show up to market, carry heavy loads, sweep floors, or tend to animals, even if their bodies begged for rest. Sometimes this only made their condition worse, prolonging the illness or causing it to worsen. But for many, it was simply a choice between bad and worse: work while sick or watch everything fall apart. Even wealthier people weren't immune to this pressure, although their situation was somewhat easier. A wealthy merchant or noble might not have to do manual labor, but their business or estate demanded attention. Illness could mean losing valuable opportunities or having others question their strength and reliability. Some tried to push through the sickness to maintain appearances and keep their social standing. Children, too, often had no choice but to continue with their daily chores, schooling, or apprenticeships, even when unwell. Childhood illnesses could leave them weak and vulnerable, but there were no sick days, no pediatricians, no comfortable beds waiting for them. Their role in family survival or household economy forced them into premature responsibility. This relentless need to work while sick also affected how diseases spread. Since sick people didn't stay home, they mingled with others, coughing, sneezing, and touching shared objects. Workplaces, markets, and farms became hotspots for infection. People were in close quarters, often with poor hygiene, and the invisible germs moved easily from one body to another. The cultural mindset reinforced this harsh reality. To be sick was often seen as a weakness or a burden. There was pride in endurance and an expectation to carry on no matter what. This attitude discouraged people from resting or asking for help. Admitting you were too ill to work might mean losing respect, or worse, losing your place in the family or community. Ultimately, the need to work despite sickness meant many people never fully recovered. They dragged themselves through their days, their bodies slowly breaking down, until sometimes their illness turned fatal. Even after the worst symptoms passed, the exhaustion and damage remained, making a full return to health difficult. In the 1700s, being sick was not only painful and frightening, it was also a luxury you could rarely afford. Survival depended on your ability to keep going, no matter how sick you felt. This harsh reality shaped the daily lives of millions and made the experience of illness one filled with suffering far beyond just the symptoms of disease. When epidemics struck in the 1700s, they brought with them waves of panic, fear, and isolation that rippled through communities like a dark storm. These outbreaks, whether smallpox, plague, influenza, or typhus, spread rapidly and unpredictably, often wiping out entire villages or overwhelming towns. The knowledge about how diseases traveled was minimal, and without vaccines or effective treatments, people felt helpless against the invisible enemy invading their lives. As news of an epidemic reached a town or village, the immediate reaction was often terror. People knew that sickness meant suffering, pain, and, all too often, death. But what made epidemics especially frightening was how contagious they were. They could strike anyone: children, elders, the healthy and strong. No one was safe, and the thought of loved ones falling ill was unbearable. Because of this fear, communities reacted with isolation. Entire families were sometimes quarantined, locked away in their homes or in specially designated sick wards, often with little food or care. Neighbors would avoid even speaking to them, afraid of catching the disease themselves. Doors might be marked with signs or symbols warning others to stay away. Some towns even set up makeshift barriers or checkpoints to prevent the spread, sometimes banning anyone suspected of being sick from entering or leaving. This isolation was brutal. People who were sick or suspected of being sick faced loneliness on top of their suffering. They might hear the sounds of life continuing outside their windows but were cut off from human contact and comfort. In many cases, families couldn't care for their sick loved ones properly because they themselves had to avoid close contact. The sick were left alone in dark, smelly rooms, with only the echo of their own pain. The panic also led to harsh social consequences. In some places, fear turned into suspicion and blame. People accused the sick of bringing misfortune or sin upon the community. Rumors and superstitions ran wild, with some believing the disease was a punishment from God or the work of witches. This often meant that sick people were not just avoided but actively shunned or even attacked. Public gatherings, markets, churches, and schools were shut down during outbreaks. Life slowed to a crawl as people stayed indoors, afraid to mingle. The economy suffered because trade stopped, farms went untended, and craftsmen had no customers. The long-lasting effects of epidemics could devastate a region for years. Doctors and healers were overwhelmed, too. Their treatments were mostly ineffective, and with no cures, many doctors fled or refused to treat the sick, adding to the panic. Hospitals, where they existed, were overcrowded and unsanitary, becoming breeding grounds for the diseases they were supposed to contain. The general population had no access to reliable information, and without understanding germs or how diseases spread, people relied on folklore and rumors. Some believed that carrying charms or burning certain herbs could protect them, while others thought the sickness came from bad air or evil spirits. This lack of scientific knowledge only added to the confusion and fear. In the worst epidemics, entire families could be wiped out within weeks. Orphans were left without homes, and widows without support. Entire communities sometimes vanished, leaving empty houses and silent streets. The memory of epidemics stayed long after they passed. Survivors often bore scars, both physical and emotional, for the rest of their lives. The trauma of losing family members, facing isolation, and living through times of terror shaped how people viewed illness and death for generations. In short, epidemics in the 1700s were not just about the disease itself, but about the overwhelming fear, the isolation it forced, and the lasting damage it did to communities and families. Being sick during an epidemic was as much a battle against loneliness and panic as it was against the illness itself. When you were sick in the 1700s, the days were tough, but the nights were often even worse, long, lonely stretches of time that seemed to stretch endlessly without relief. Unlike today, where a sick person might have the comfort of a warm, quiet room, a loving caregiver, and distractions like books or music, those nights were filled with silence, discomfort, and a deep sense of isolation. At night, the house often grew colder, and the flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows on the walls. There were no electric lights or heaters, so patients had to rely on thick blankets and the warmth of their own body or the occasional shared fire to keep the chill at bay. If the sick person lived in a small cottage or crowded home, the room might be shared with others, but this didn't necessarily bring comfort. The close quarters meant little privacy, and the noise from other family members or animals could make restful sleep impossible. Pain and discomfort often intensified at night. Fevers might spike, coughing fits could worsen, or wounds might ache more sharply when the body was still. Without modern painkillers or soothing medications, there was little relief from the physical suffering. Many people lay awake, tossing and turning, their bodies racked with chills or sweating, too weak or too restless to find peace. Emotional loneliness was just as profound. Families were often busy with their own work, especially at night when there was less to do but worry. Caregivers, usually untrained family members or neighbors, might check in briefly but had little means to ease the patient's mental distress. There were no therapists or counselors, no one trained to help with the fears and anxieties that illness brought. The mind could wander to frightening places in these quiet hours. Many people feared death intensely, especially since illness was so often a slow, painful decline. Thoughts of loved ones left behind, unfinished tasks, or the uncertainty of recovery haunted them. The silence was filled with the sounds of their own breathing, their heartbeat, or the occasional distant noise outside, perhaps the howl of a dog or the creak of a door, that reminded them of the loneliness. Without distractions, the mind might also turn to superstition or prayer, hoping for relief or a miracle. Some might whisper prayers, clutching a worn charm or religious item for comfort. Others might stare into the darkness, feeling helpless as the hours dragged on. Sick children faced particularly difficult nights. Too weak to move much, they could cry out from pain or fear, but often there was no one to soothe them properly. Parents, exhausted from their own work and worries, could only offer so much comfort. The helplessness on both sides was crushing. Even the physical environment made the nights hard. Sick rooms often smelled of stale sweat, unwashed bodies, and the lingering odors of herbs or medicines. Bedding was rough and rarely cleaned, making it itchy and uncomfortable. The lack of fresh air or proper ventilation sometimes made breathing more difficult, especially for those with respiratory illnesses. In many cases, the nights might bring worsening symptoms with no way to call for help or ease the pain. If the condition deteriorated, the patient might feel themselves slipping away, all alone in the dark. The silence and stillness of the night could feel like a harsh reminder of mortality. This combination of physical agony, emotional isolation, and the long, empty hours made being sick in the 1700s a uniquely dreadful experience. The nights were not a time for healing rest but a time of waiting and hoping, for dawn, for relief, for return to health that might or might not come. In the 1700s, many people didn't trust doctors. This distrust wasn't without reason, given the state of medicine at the time. Doctors often had little real knowledge about what caused illnesses or how to cure them, and many treatments could be painful, useless, or even harmful. Because of this, ordinary people frequently questioned whether seeing a doctor was worth the trouble or the expense. Doctors were sometimes seen as distant figures, more interested in their own status or making money than actually helping their patients. They wore formal clothes and carried themselves with an air of authority, but behind the scenes, their tools and methods were crude by today's standards. People knew that doctors often recommended treatments like bloodletting or purging, which could leave patients weaker or sicker than before. This made people wary of their advice. Many patients also had stories of doctors who had failed to cure loved ones or who had caused infections after surgeries. With no effective antibiotics or sterilization, wounds often became infected after being treated, and death rates were high even under medical care. This reinforced the idea that doctors could sometimes do more harm than good. Additionally, the gap between doctors and ordinary people was wide. Medical knowledge was often confined to universities and the wealthy, while the poor relied on home remedies, folk healers, or local wise women. Doctors sometimes looked down on these traditional healers, but common people trusted them more because they were familiar, accessible, and had practical experience. Doctors were also difficult to access for many. They were expensive and mostly found in larger towns or cities, so rural people might never see a qualified doctor. When they did, the experience could feel intimidating or cold. This lack of personal connection made people less likely to trust doctors with their health. Superstitions and religious beliefs played a role, too. Some people believed that illness was a punishment from God or the work of evil spirits. In those cases, doctors' physical treatments might be seen as less important than spiritual remedies like prayer or rituals. Turning to a doctor could be viewed as a lack of faith or even dangerous meddling with divine will. The uncertainty and fear surrounding illness meant that many people preferred to avoid doctors if they could. They might try to tough it out on their own, rely on advice from family members, or seek out herbalists and midwives instead. This distrust slowed medical progress because fewer people sought or accepted professional help, limiting the chance to learn from cases or improve treatments. Even among those who did visit doctors, there was often skepticism. Patients might question the doctor's diagnosis, refuse certain treatments, or stop visiting altogether if they didn't see quick improvement. The lack of effective cures made medical care seem more like a gamble than a guarantee of healing. In summary, distrust of doctors in the 1700s was a natural reaction to the limits of medicine at the time. With painful treatments, high risks, and uncertain outcomes, many people felt safer relying on themselves, family, or local healers. This distrust added another layer of difficulty to being sick in a time when professional medical care was still struggling to find its footing. Medicine in the 1700s was often too expensive for most people to afford, adding another heavy burden to those who were already struggling with illness. Unlike today, where there are public hospitals, health insurance, or government programs to help cover medical costs, back then, almost all medical expenses had to be paid out of pocket. This made seeking treatment a luxury that many simply could not afford. Doctors charged fees for visits, diagnoses, and treatments, and these fees could quickly add up. Even basic medicines, herbs, tinctures, or potions, were costly, especially when they were imported or required rare ingredients. For many families, the cost of medicine could mean sacrificing food, clothing, or other essentials. This financial strain meant that illness could push a family into poverty or deepen their existing hardships. Pharmacies, known as apothecaries, were the places people went to buy medicines, but apothecaries often charged high prices for their wares. Some medicines were mixtures of herbs and other natural substances, while others contained dangerous ingredients like mercury, lead, or opium. Despite their questionable effectiveness, these medicines were often expensive because of their preparation or the rarity of ingredients. For the poor, the price of medicine was out of reach. They had to rely on homemade remedies or the help of neighbors and family, which might not be effective but were free or very cheap. This gap in access meant that the rich had a better chance of receiving treatment, while the poor were left to suffer and hope for recovery on their own. Even wealthier families had to be careful about medical costs. Hiring a doctor to visit your home could be a major expense, and surgeries or longer treatments could drain family resources. Because illness was often prolonged, repeated visits and ongoing care could bankrupt a household. This expense also discouraged many from seeking help early on. Instead of calling a doctor or going to an apothecary at the first sign of illness, people often waited until they were very sick, sometimes too sick to recover easily. Early intervention, which can be crucial in treating many diseases, was rare because of the fear of costs. Furthermore, there was no standard pricing or regulation for medical treatments. Some doctors charged exorbitant fees, taking advantage of desperate patients, while others might offer cheaper or barter-based services. The lack of transparency meant people often didn't know what they would owe until after treatment. In summary, the high cost of medicine in the 1700s made being sick not only a physical and emotional challenge but also a financial nightmare. Many people avoided seeking medical care simply because they could not afford it, which often meant their illnesses worsened. This harsh reality made the experience of sickness even more difficult during that time. When you got sick in the 1700s, it wasn't just your body that suffered. Your whole life could get thrown off track, and catching up was often nearly impossible. There were no sick leaves, no social safety nets, and no understanding bosses or systems to help you when you missed work or daily tasks. Sickness meant falling behind, and falling behind could have serious consequences. Most people worked hard every day just to survive. Farmers had crops that needed tending, animals to feed, and fields to harvest, all on a strict seasonal schedule. Missing a single day could mean a loss in food production or income, and in the worst cases, it could threaten the entire family's livelihood. For city dwellers, tradespeople, labourers, or servants, missing work meant no wages, no food money, and no way to pay rent or buy essentials. Because of this, many sick people forced themselves to keep working despite feeling terrible. They might drag themselves out of bed, weak and feverish, to fulfill their duties. This often made their illness worse or prolonged recovery. The pressure to work while sick wasn't just about personal pride, it was survival. Children who got sick often fell behind in their basic education or apprenticeships, if they were lucky enough to attend school or learn a trade at all. Missing time learning skills could mean fewer opportunities later in life. Many children also had chores or responsibilities at home that couldn't be ignored, so illness could disrupt the delicate balance of family survival. For the sick themselves, especially adults, falling behind was a dangerous spiral. A long illness could lead to loss of income, making it hard to buy food, medicine, or clothing. This economic strain could cause stress, which in turn made recovery even harder. If the illness was serious enough, it might mean losing a job or being unable to return to the same level of work afterward. The social consequences were just as severe. Being sick and unable to contribute could lead to a loss of respect or status within a community. In some cases, people might be seen as weak, lazy, or a burden. This social stigma could isolate the sick person further, making recovery feel lonelier and more difficult. Families with a sick member often had to adjust their daily routines dramatically. Other members had to pick up extra work or find ways to support the household. This added pressure could strain relationships and deepen the hardships caused by illness. In short, sickness in the 1700s was not just a physical condition, it was a major disruption to life's fragile balance. Falling behind in work, education, and social standing was a real and painful consequence that made the experience of being sick even harder. For many, the long road to recovery wasn't just about healing the body but also about trying to catch up on a life that had paused in their absence. Leeches were a common and widely accepted treatment during the 1700s, and their use was rooted in the medical theories of the time, particularly the ancient concept of balancing the body's humors. According to this belief, health depended on maintaining a balance among four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. When someone got sick, it was thought that one or more of these humors was out of balance, often with too much blood causing problems. Leeches were used to draw that excess blood out, a practice known as bloodletting. The idea of using leeches might sound strange and even gross to us today, but it was considered a standard medical treatment. Physicians and barber surgeons would apply live leeches to a patient's skin, usually on the arms, legs, or neck. The leeches would attach themselves and suck blood for anywhere from several minutes to an hour. The process was believed to relieve pressure and purify the body by removing harmful substances. Unfortunately, this treatment was not only ineffective but often dangerous. Leeches could suck out too much blood, leaving patients weak, dizzy, or even unconscious. The wounds left behind could become infected, and without antiseptics, infections could quickly turn deadly. Sometimes, the use of leeches was repeated multiple times during a single illness, weakening the patient further rather than helping. Despite these risks, leeches were cheap and accessible, which made them popular, especially since doctors and patients were desperate for any treatment that seemed to offer relief. They were even used to treat a wide range of ailments, from fevers and headaches to skin conditions and internal diseases. The widespread belief in their usefulness persisted well into the 19th century before medical science finally disproved their effectiveness in most cases. Leeches were also symbolic of how little was understood about disease and treatment at the time. Since doctors didn't know about germs or the real causes of illness, they relied on visible signs like fever or redness and assumed the body needed balancing. Bloodletting was an attempt to intervene physically, even though it often made things worse. This common use of leeches reflects the desperation people felt when sick. They wanted something, anything, that might cure them, and the leech, slimy and unsettling though it was, represented hope. For many, the sight of a leech being applied was a sign that help was on the way, even if that help was more harmful than healing. In the end, the use of leeches highlights how rough and uncertain medical care was in the 1700s. It shows how far medicine has come since then and helps explain why being sick in that time was so frightening and difficult. Beds in the 1700s were far from the comfortable, clean, and cozy spaces we know today. When you were sick, having a good place to rest was crucial, but unfortunately, most beds were uncomfortable and often dirty, making recovery even harder. For many people, beds were simple wooden frames with straw, hay, or coarse feathers stuffed into mattresses. These materials provided little cushioning and could be lumpy or uneven. The mattresses were often old and reused for years, sometimes shared by several family members, which meant they accumulated dirt, sweat, insects, and other unpleasant things over time. Bed linens were washed infrequently, if at all, due to the labor-intensive nature of laundry and the lack of modern detergents. For someone who was sick and already weak, lying in such a bed could be uncomfortable or even painful. Pressure sores and rashes could develop from lying on rough, dirty surfaces, and the presence of pests like fleas and lice was common. These insects not only caused itching and discomfort but also spread diseases, making the sick person's environment more hazardous. In wealthier homes, beds might be larger, with finer linens and more padding, but even these were nowhere near the hygiene standards we expect today. Heavy blankets and drapes hung around the bed to keep warmth in, but they also trapped stale air and smells, which could be unpleasant for a sick person struggling to breathe easily. In poorer households, beds were often shared by several family members, and sometimes the sick had to sleep in whatever corner or spot was available. This lack of a dedicated, clean sleeping space made rest and isolation nearly impossible, and it increased the chance of spreading illness to others in the home. In addition to the physical discomfort, beds were sometimes located in rooms that were cold, damp, or poorly ventilated. Without modern heating or insulation, sick rooms could feel drafty and chilly, which was especially hard on those already battling fevers or weakness. The combination of uncomfortable beds and unpleasant room conditions made rest, a key part of healing, difficult to achieve. Overall, beds in the 1700s were more of a necessity than a comfort, especially for the sick. They were often dirty, uncomfortable, and shared, offering little relief or rest to those who needed it most. This reality made being sick an even more miserable experience, prolonging suffering and slowing recovery. Sick rooms in the 1700s were rarely the quiet, peaceful spaces we imagine today. Instead, they were often noisy, crowded, and chaotic places that added to the misery of being ill. Homes during this time were usually small and packed with family members, so when someone got sick, there was little room to give them privacy or peace. In many households, especially among the poor or working classes, the sick room was just a corner of a shared room or a small chamber where several people slept, worked, or lived. The sick person might be surrounded by family members, children, animals, and household noise all day and night. This lack of space made it difficult for the ill to rest properly or avoid disturbances. Noise was a constant presence. In large homes, servants might be bustling about, running errands, preparing meals, or tending to other duties, creating a lively but distracting environment. In smaller homes, the noise of cooking fires, conversations, crying children, and livestock could fill the same cramped space where the sick person lay. This cacophony made it nearly impossible for someone to find quiet and rest, which was essential for healing. Visitors might also come to see the sick, often bringing news, prayers, or superstitions. While their intentions might have been kind, these visits added more noise and activity, interrupting the patient's rest. At times, sick rooms became places of tension, with family members arguing over care or resources, further disturbing the atmosphere. Because privacy was rare, people often had to endure being watched or tended by many hands, some helpful and some not. This lack of solitude could be embarrassing or exhausting, especially when dignity was already compromised by illness. The crowded conditions also meant that diseases spread quickly among family members. Without understanding of germs or infection control, the sick room could become a hotspot for new illnesses. This made being in the sick room doubly frightening. Not only was the patient suffering, but others in the household were at constant risk. Even in wealthier households, where there might be more rooms and servants, the sick room wasn't always calm or quiet. The stress and urgency surrounding illness could cause worry, shouting, and frantic activity. Nurses or attendants might come and go, adding to the sense of disruption rather than comfort. In all, sick rooms in the 1700s were far from restful havens. Instead, they were often noisy, cramped, and full of activity, making the experience of illness lonelier and more difficult. The very place where someone hoped to find relief often contributed to their suffering, extending the time it took to heal and adding to the emotional weight of being sick. When someone fell ill in the 1700s, professional medical care was a rare luxury that many simply couldn't afford or access. Instead, the primary caregivers were usually family members or neighbors who had no formal training in medicine or nursing. This meant that care often relied on guesswork, folk knowledge, and whatever remedies or comfort the caregiver could provide. Family members, mothers, wives, siblings, or children, were expected to take on the responsibility of nursing the sick. They might prepare simple broths, fetch water, apply poultices, or try to soothe fevers with cool cloths. While their efforts came from genuine concern and love, they lacked scientific understanding of illness, hygiene, or infection control. This made it easy for infections to spread or worsen without anyone realizing it. Neighbors might also step in to help, especially in tight-knit rural communities where people depended on one another. However, their knowledge was mostly passed down through generations, based on tradition rather than evidence. They might suggest herbal remedies, charms, or rituals thought to drive out illness or bad spirits. Because there were no formal nursing schools, caregivers had no standardized training on how to handle emergencies, monitor symptoms, or provide comfort. Simple tasks like changing bedding, cleaning wounds, or feeding a patient were done as best as possible but could unintentionally cause harm or discomfort. The lack of professional care also meant that many illnesses were misdiagnosed or misunderstood. Family caregivers might not recognize serious symptoms or know when to seek a doctor, which could delay treatment and reduce chances of survival. In wealthier households, there might be servants or attendants who helped care for the sick, but even they were rarely trained medical professionals. Their work often focused on comfort and practical support rather than medical treatment. This reliance on untrained caregivers highlights how vulnerable sick people were. They depended heavily on the goodwill and limited knowledge of those around them, which could be inconsistent and sometimes insufficient. It also meant that recovery was often slow and incomplete because the care lacked the expertise needed to truly heal. In essence, the 1700s saw a time when the safety net for the sick was fragile and informal. Without trained nurses or structured medical support, the experience of being ill was not only painful but uncertain, leaving many to suffer in silence or with inadequate care from those closest to them. In the 1700s, the idea of pain relief as we know it today was practically non-existent. When people were sick or injured, they often faced intense pain with almost no way to ease their suffering. There were no modern painkillers like aspirin, acetaminophen, or morphine available, and the options for dulling or managing pain were extremely limited and largely ineffective. Natural remedies were used in some cases. Herbs such as willow bark, which contains a compound related to aspirin, might be chewed or brewed into a tea. But these remedies worked slowly, if at all, and were not widely understood or trusted. In many cases, the pain had to be endured without any real relief. For more severe pain, especially during surgery or injury, the situation was brutal. Before anesthesia was discovered and commonly used in the 19th century, patients were fully conscious during operations. Surgeons had to work as quickly as possible because the pain was excruciating. Patients might be physically restrained, held down by friends or family, or given alcohol or opium derivatives if available, to dull the pain slightly, but these were far from reliable or safe methods. The absence of effective painkillers meant that everyday illnesses that involved inflammation, headaches, toothaches, or fevers brought long hours, even days, of unrelenting discomfort. People had to rely on rest, distraction, or spiritual comfort to help them cope. The emotional and psychological toll of constant pain without relief was immense. Chronic sufferers might become depressed, anxious, or despondent, as their pain seemed endless and untreated. Families watching their loved ones in agony often felt helpless and powerless. This lack of pain management also affected how people viewed illness and injury. The fear of pain was so great that some might avoid seeking medical help or delay necessary treatment simply to avoid the torment of surgery or other painful interventions. All in all, the 1700s were a time when pain was a harsh, unavoidable companion for the sick and injured. The absence of effective painkillers made recovery slower, suffering deeper, and illness a more frightening experience. In the 1700s, something as simple and essential as drinking water could actually make a sick person's condition much worse. Clean, safe drinking water was not readily available or understood, and the connection between contaminated water and illness was completely unknown. This lack of knowledge caused many avoidable health problems, especially for those already vulnerable because they were sick. Water sources were often shared by entire communities and could easily become polluted. Rivers, wells, and springs might be contaminated with human waste, animal droppings, or industrial runoff from tanneries, mills, and slaughterhouses. Yet, people had no idea that drinking such water could spread diseases like cholera, dysentery, or typhoid fever, all of which were deadly and common at the time. When someone was sick, their body was weaker and more prone to infections. Drinking contaminated water could introduce new germs or toxins, worsening their condition. Sometimes, a patient trying to stay hydrated might unknowingly drink water that caused stomach cramps, diarrhea, or vomiting, symptoms that could quickly become life-threatening due to dehydration and further weakness. There were no water treatment methods like boiling or filtration commonly practiced by ordinary people, and municipal water systems didn't exist. Wells could become breeding grounds for bacteria, but people relied on them anyway because there was no alternative. Even rainwater collection was not always safe, as containers might be dirty or exposed to pollutants. People tried to avoid bad water based on taste or smell, but many harmful microorganisms are invisible and odorless, so judging water by senses alone was unreliable. When people suspected water was unsafe, they sometimes turned to alcohol like beer or cider, which was often safer because the fermentation process killed some pathogens. However, this was not always an option, especially for the sick who might not tolerate alcohol. Doctors and healers in the 1700s had no understanding of microbes or the importance of sanitation, so they couldn't advise patients to avoid certain water sources. In fact, some believed illnesses were caused by bad air or miasma rather than waterborne germs, which didn't help the situation. In short, drinking water in the 1700s was a gamble, especially for someone already sick. Without clean water, dehydration, additional infections, and worsening symptoms were common, making recovery even more difficult. This hidden danger added to the hardships of illness and contributed to the high mortality rates of the time. In the 1700s, one of the most frustrating and terrifying aspects of being sick was that no one truly knew what illness you had. Medical knowledge was rudimentary, and doctors lacked the tools and understanding to accurately diagnose diseases. Without microscopes capable of identifying bacteria or viruses, and with limited knowledge of anatomy and physiology, illness was often a mystery even to the most educated healers of the time. Symptoms like fever, cough, rash, or pain were observed and noted, but they could mean many different things. For example, a high fever might be caused by influenza, pneumonia, malaria, or even a simple infection, yet there was no way to pinpoint the exact cause. Many diseases shared similar symptoms, which made diagnosis based solely on observation highly unreliable. Doctors often relied on theories inherited from ancient Greek and Roman medicine, like the imbalance of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. They believed that sickness resulted from an excess or deficiency of one of these fluids, leading them to prescribe treatments aimed at restoring balance, regardless of the actual disease. This approach sometimes made conditions worse or failed to address the real problem. Without clear diagnoses, treatments were often guesswork. The same symptoms could lead to very different remedies, depending on the doctor, region, or popular beliefs. Some patients might be subjected to bloodletting, while others were given herbal concoctions or advised to rest. This inconsistency could confuse and frustrate patients and their families. Even common illnesses were often misnamed or misunderstood. Diseases like tuberculosis might be called consumption, and smallpox was sometimes confused with other rash-causing illnesses. Mental illnesses were frequently misinterpreted as possession or moral failings rather than medical conditions. This lack of understanding extended to the social level as well. Communities didn't know how to identify or isolate contagious diseases properly, which allowed infections to spread more easily. People might assume someone was cursed, sinful, or simply unlucky without realizing they were dealing with a specific illness that could affect many others. For the sick person, not knowing the nature of their illness added a layer of fear and uncertainty. Without a clear diagnosis, there was no clear path to recovery, no assurance that treatment would help, and no knowledge of how long the sickness would last. Families often feared the worst, not knowing whether their loved one had a minor ailment or a fatal disease. In essence, the 1700s were marked by a profound ignorance about the causes and nature of disease. This lack of knowledge made the experience of illness confusing, frightening, and unpredictable, contributing to the overall misery of being sick during that time. In the 1700s, the vast majority of people who became seriously ill or injured faced the end of their lives at home, rather than in hospitals or specialized care facilities like we have today. Hospitals existed but were few, often overcrowded, and generally reserved for the very poor, or for those without family to care for them. Even then, conditions in hospitals were grim, with little chance for comfort or effective treatment. For most people, the home was the place where sickness played out, from the first signs of illness through to recovery or death. Family members took on the responsibility of nursing the sick, often in small, cramped rooms with little ventilation or cleanliness. When death was imminent, the household prepared for it quietly, often with neighbors or clergy present to offer prayers and last rites. Dying at home meant that families were deeply involved in the care and final moments of their loved ones, but it also meant that they had to manage the heavy emotional and physical toll without much support. There were no professional hospice services or trained caregivers to ease the burden. Because of the lack of medical understanding and treatment options, death was a frequent outcome of serious illness. People were accustomed to high mortality rates, especially among children and the elderly. Still, losing a family member at home was devastating, made even more difficult by the absence of effective medical help. Homes where death occurred were often marked by fear and sadness, with the sickbed becoming a place of intense suffering and uncertainty. The dying person might be isolated to prevent the spread of disease, yet surrounded by families struggling to provide comfort despite their limited knowledge. The fact that death happened mostly at home also influenced social customs and attitudes around illness. Funerals and mourning were deeply personal affairs conducted within the community, and the experience of sickness was shared closely among family and neighbors. In short, dying at home was the norm in the 1700s because medical care was minimal and hospitals were not accessible or effective. This reality shaped how people lived and died, making sickness a profoundly personal and communal experience, but also one marked by hardship, fear, and limited hope. This video is for educational or entertainment purposes only, and information provided in the video may be incorrect. If you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing to the channel and like the video. Good night.